Welcome to In the Studio. I'm your host, Kristin Trent, brought to you by Davis Media Access. Today I'm joined by a young PhD researcher whose work is telling us about how bird behaviors are being affected by climate change. Jacob, I'd like to welcome you into the studio today.
Hey, Kristen. Great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Great. So I just want to dive into these questions and give the viewers a chance to understand what your work is about. So, the first question I have for you is what is the link between the study of bird behavior and the climate crisis that we're experiencing right now?
Hmm. Yeah, that's an excellent question. Birds are well known, what we call indicator species. Birds are extremely responsive to changes in the environment around them. And furthermore, they're very easy to track down. Individual species really stand out in the multitude of environments they populate around the planet. And so that makes following birds, tracking birds, and studying their behavior and their survival a really, really useful tool for researchers seeking to understand how this breadth of change affecting the planet is in more detail affecting the local wildlife.
Wow, that's truly fascinating to hear that birds can be this indicator for us as a tool to see how climate change is progressing. So, I want to hear a little bit about the current population that you're studying.
Yeah. So my primary study species, the main species that I'm working on in my PhD project is called the Dark-eyed Junco. It's a very, very common little songbird species that lives all over the continental U.S. And many parts of Canada. And it is an extremely popular model species for researchers looking how to understand um, bird evolution and behavior might be driven by changes in the environment. And so it is, in for this reason, an excellent choice for my primary study, which is on how wildfires might be driving changes in animal behavior, creating this incredibly new, incredibly different environment for animals.
Excellent, and I'm sure that's super prevalent in California, where we have increasing wildfires as well. Can you tell me a little bit about what it was like to conduct this type of research and walk me through what a day in the life looked like for you on the field?
Yeah, that's let's see. So, first, a typical day of research. I mean, the first thing we do, obviously, is we have a long road trip out to our field site. When we get there, we'll usually set up camp. I don't do this work alone. I do work with a number of really wonderful undergraduate researchers and my PhD advisor, a number of graduate students that I'm collaborating with. Um, we get set up, and our day typically starts a little before 6 a.m. Um, you know, we get going when the birds get going, and to that end, we get up with the dawn. And normally, what we'll do is the night before, I may have scouted a couple of different areas where I think there may be a likely nest. So, nesting sites are especially important during the breeding season. That is going to be where we find pairs of birds that we're looking to capture. And so we'll go from site to site, and from there, we will just go bird by bird and do our best to safely capture and record data um, and analyze the behavior of each individual.
Wow, okay. So can you tell me what location you're going out to see these birds? Is it near Davis at all?
It's fairly close to Davis. Yeah, I actually have a couple of study sites. One of them is at Quail Ridge Natural Reserve, which is I think, 30 minutes by car, 40 minutes by car from Davis. a little, just a little ways from Napa, close to Lake Berryessa. My primary study area is in Lassen National Forest, and that is some 3.5 hours to the north east of where we are. It's a massive state forest, um, surrounded by lots of mountains, and also host to Lassen Volcanic National Park, which is an incredible just place to visit, but also just a wonderful field site as well. Um, this season, the snowfall was so intense that I actually had to restrict a lot of my activities to the lower elevations kind of around Lassen Volcanic National Park. Um, but it was really, really cool to see, even going up there just for a bit. So yeah, Lassen National Forest is my primary study site, but I do have a number of sites on the surrounding areas, um, whether that's Quail Ridge, whether that's the surrounding forests in Siskiyou County. Yeah, there's a number of sites all affected by wildfires, and I have a feeling as wildfires continue to spread around California, I may have some new study sites next year as well.
Sure, totally understandable. So, can you tell us a little bit about what types of measurements you take on these birds and how are they, what are they telling you about the changing behavior of the species in response to the growing wildfires?
Mm. So the measurements we take are both behavioral and morphological, or morphological meaning relating to the body. So for the behavioral measurements, what I like to do is conduct something called a playback experiment. These juncos are extremely territorial. They will defend the areas they claim for their nest, um, with a lot of tiny ferocity. And to elicit that, what you can do is get a speaker and play a recording of another dark-eyed junco singing in the bird's territory. So these birds use song as a means of defending their territories and potentially also attracting mates. And so it's a big no-no to start singing in another junco's territory. That is an act of aggression. Those are fighting words. Um, so when I play Junko song from a speaker, that often elicits a very aggressive response from the territory's owner, the territory's occupant, which immediately will start to try to chase that imaginary intruder out. So what I do is I count the intensity of that chase response. I look at how many times it flies from one perch to another looking for the intruder, the number of times it counter sings. So um, oftentimes in a contest, juncos will sing back and forth. Um, so I look at the rate at which it's doing that. I look at how close it gets to the speaker. And finally, in the most extreme cases, these juncos will actually do a little attack swoop down over the speaker, trying to look for the intruder itself. So I count all these together, and what I'm going to be doing is putting that into an overall score, um, sort of a compounded version of all these behaviors that's going to tell us just exactly how intense the playback response is. For the morphological measurements, uh, I after doing this whole behavioral test for the bird, I set out um, what's called a mist net. So a mist net, it's basically it's a, think of like a very very thin, maybe a very thin small tennis or volleyball net, a little bit higher than that, and very difficult to see except in direct sunlight. And what I do is we unfurl that, we roll it out, um, and I place the speaker under it again. I start doing the playback, and sure enough, as the bird is looking for that intruder, often it will zoom into the net and fall neatly into one of the pockets, where we carefully will go up and extract the bird, take the bird out of the net, and then we will measure different parts of the bird's body. One of the most common ones is the tarsus. So that'd be the equivalent of like your shin, something like that. It would uh, it's this piece part of the leg that sort of bends outward and is attached to the foot. That's the tarsus of the bird. We also measure the length of their wing cord. That would be like this on us. There I am doing that. Actually, I have those same measuring pliers with us. There we go.
Oh,
And so
excellent.
yeah, it's simple. You take the bird, and this little. So there's actually two dials here. Um, I don't know how easily you can see that. There we go. But as I'm measuring the bird, um, this bar up here.
Uh-huh.
Oop, there we go, is telling us the length to the nearest tens place. So we have 10, 20, 30, and then this wheel, this sort of clock-like structure here, is telling us the length to the nearest millimeter and then zero point 0.1
Ooh,
millimeter. And so
wow.
that's how we get
All
really
right.
precise measurements as we go up and
Awesome.
down of the length of the bird's wing and its tarsus. And then finally, we weigh the bird. And so by looking at the ratio of the bird's body size with its body mass, that's one way, among others, we can tell what kind of condition the bird's in.
Okay.
How, yeah.
Okay, so it sounds like these bodily measurements you're taking are telling us something about the bird's physical fitness. Is that what you're looking for?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Mhm. And there's a
And
number of other measurements to do as well. So pardon me,
no worries.
but this is one of several measurements that we do. Yeah.
And this bird's physical fitness, is it changing in results to their habitat and the wildfire conditions in California?
So far, we are not sure. Um, there remains to be a lot of data processing done on this project. But what I can tell you is that although I don't have completed data on the physical measurements, I do have enough on the behavioral measurements that I'm confident enough to say that it seems like birds in these wildfire affected areas are much more aggressive in response to playback. So they're giving a lot more of those counter songs, flights, attack swoops in front of the speaker. It seems to be that birds in these fire affected areas are much more defensive of their territories.
Okay, okay. And was there any was there any thought of why they might be more defensive in a wildfire devastated area as opposed to one that hadn't been devastated to that extent?
Yes, I've certainly given that a lot of thought. Um, why exactly would birds in these fire affected areas be so aggressive? You would think that perhaps in a fire affected area, they would actually be less aggressive if they're trying to defend you know, a a useful territory. I would think, maybe there's so much burn, so much destruction in their area that there's not as much worth defending. That's one idea, but I think more likely the reason that we are seeing this change is that birds are dealing with limited resources. They are dealing with conditions that are harsh and may encourage birds to defend what resources they can find that more strongly. And I think one of the most
Mhm.
crucial pieces of evidence supporting this is that within these massive burn areas, you'll find all over the West, all over California, there are these little patches of unburnt habitat that remain. I call them islands. I think you can think of them as like oases, but yeah, there are these little, often less than 100 feet uh, somewhere along those lines. But these little patches of trees and green shrubs and all that. And the birds that I captured in those areas and the birds that I ran playback on in those little islands in the middle of the burn were the most aggressive by far. more than the birds in the regular burnt areas and more than the birds in the unburnt habitat. And that seems to indicate to me that it has something to do with the quality of the territory that they're able to find, especially in the middle of an area that's otherwise very devastated and very harsh.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a definite tie to the amount of resources that are available. And with the increasing number of wildfires, I'm sure it sounds like this research is going to help fuel conservation efforts, ways to help birds, specifically the species that you're studying and how they combat the climate crisis in general. But I do
Yeah.
wonder, has the research that you have been doing with these dark-eyed juncos, could it be applied to be a predictor for other bird populations? Are you looking into studying other types of birds and thinking about how they may be affected by the climate crisis?
Well, Kristen, that's exactly the next step for this research. Once we continue to process the data and um, see what we can find from, again, this indicator, this model species of an indicator group of species. I think the next step is, of course, to see how other birds are responding. Dark-eyed juncos are known um, kind of what's called a generalist. They have a lot of different resources that they can feed on. They seem to do pretty well in a lot of different environments. What about birds that are not generalists? What about birds that have very, very specific habitat requirements? Um, the National Audubon Society predicts that approximately 50% of the Junco's native range is going to be lost in California and Oregon over in the kind of worst case climate warming scenario of 3 degrees Celsius. It'll be something like 30% under 2 degrees Celsius. For many species, that habitat loss could be much, much more intense, which means that with habitat loss, the amount of habitat further affected by wildfires is only going to be relatively higher. So it's going to be really important to figure out which species are going to be priorities for conservation. In the case of the junco's behavior, this might indicate to us that birds might actually need to be afforded more space um, in
Mhm.
especially in fire affected areas. This could also potentially affect attempts to reintroduce birds to areas that are affected by wildfires if the residents of those areas are extremely aggressive and more likely to push out newcomers to these areas. So these are all factors to consider as climate change continues to affect bird habitat, and especially as wildfires continue to expand across California.
Yeah, it sounds like your research is very timely in the efforts that we need to be making as a community and overall in combating the climate crisis to protect these birds. Can you tell me a little bit about any birds that have come to suburban areas and maybe in Davis? Are there any dark-eyed juncos here? What can people do here to help birds that are experiencing generally less a, less of a specific environment where they have the amount of resources that they would normally have?
That's an excellent question too. Um, Many birds are seemingly uh, able to do well in areas populated by humans. But very often, these birds are either extremely populated across the US uh, uh, or are, in fact, invasive species, non native species, like the Eurasian house sparrow. Um,
Okay.
so, when people are trying to make their habitat or their area in suburban areas better, especially for native species of birds, um, one of the things to do is try to create habitat or areas that are going to be really appealing, especially to those native species. That means planting gardens with native species of plants. That means getting specialized bird houses. Bird feeders are obviously excellent in general. However, um, they're a little bit less maybe precise. Um, so the individual habitat needs of birds are very different. They can vary extremely widely from bird to bird.
Hmm.
In order to develop things in an urban or suburban environment that is appealing to a to a wide range of species, there really has to be a lot of work uh, developing infrastructure even that is very particular to the needs of each native species. So again, native plants, specialized infrastructure perhaps for birds that have kind of very special nest requirements, but at the end of the day, um, it may very well be that habitat in their native ranges for some species, maybe outside of where humans typically dwell, maybe that is ultimately what is needed. But again, it depends on the bird. There are some birds that are going to do just fine being our neighbors, and there are some birds that kind of need their own territory. They need their own space to thrive.
Okay, well, it sounds like you highlighted a number of things that people can do locally, even to help general bird populations recover from the amount of wildfires that we're experiencing in California. Of course, it sounds like in a perfect world, there could be some more efforts to help more rural areas in reforesting and helping those areas with resources as well. But I wanted to thank you so much, Jacob, for joining us here today and telling us about the research that you're doing to ultimately help these populations combat what we're going to be experiencing even more in the coming years. For more
Thank you.
information about Jacob and his research, please visit jacobjohnson.com. Once again, I'm your host, Kristin Trent, and this has been In the Studio with Davis Media Access.